Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event for Burnout, the emotional experience of political defeat. I hope I'm holding this actually into the camera properly. I'm Sarah Jaffe. I'm the author of Work Won't Love You Back, Necessary Trouble, and a new book that is over here behind me called From the Ashes, which is coming in a couple of months. But we are here to talk about Hannah's book. So Hannah Proctor holds a Wellcome Trust University Award at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And she's the author of two books, Psychologies and Revolution, Alexander Luria's Romantic Science and Soviet Social History, which is published in the Palgrave Macmillan series Mental Health and Historical Perspective in 2020, and the book we're here to talk about now, Burnout, the Emotional Experience of Political Defeat, which is, you can get it now from Verso, and I'm pretty sure there's probably a link in front of my face right now talking about that. She's a member of the editorial collective of Radical Philosophy, a contributing editor at Parapraxis magazine, and is web and reviews editor of The History of the Human Sciences, all of which is to say she's much fancier than me and much more qualified to talk about all of these subjects. So we're here in a very interesting political moment. I think it feels a little bit like with the British and French election results and the withdrawal of Joe Biden in the US, like we've kind of slid backwards into neoliberal denialism and delusion, slapped over the doom like a bad coat of paint. But I imagine that anybody who's here listening to this or listening to the recording later is here because something about Hannah's book speaks to you. You are now or have at some point been grappling with the feeling and the fallout of defeat. The book really has spoken to me in the last week while I've been reading and preparing for this event, dealing with some stuff that I've been facing in my personal life and these political questions that are incredibly thorny and sometimes seem unsolvable in this moment. So I am, in fact, really happy to be here despite our somewhat depressing subject. And speaking of depression, I am just going to go there first. Hannah, your book does include some fairly frank discussion of your own depression and its political connections. And as I was saying, I found the way you wrote about it both deeply relatable and oddly comforting. So I wonder if you mind talking about the decision to write about yourself and your own struggles with hopelessness.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me, Sarah. I saw that you had this book coming out that's also kind of about grief and fire, ashes, burning, etc. Burning up, burning out.
Yep.
So yeah, I thought we'd have some overlaps. And thank you to everyone for coming. The third chapter of my book is on depression. It has 8 chapters and they're all based on different depressing concepts. It's like a litany of different depressing concepts, and one of them is depression itself. So I worked on the chapter for a really long time and it really wasn't working, and I wasn't originally in the book as much as I ended up being. Like I didn't really plan to be in the book so much. And I ended up putting myself into that chapter because I was really kind of stuck trying to articulate something about the relationship between depression and politics. And I suppose I was quite familiar with certain arguments that I guess I would have most probably first encountered from someone like Mark Fisher.
Yeah.
An argument that, depression is best understood as being caused by, living under capitalism and the kind of immiserating conditions of the social world in which people live, and that the kind of therefore then the cure for depression would be a changing our social conditions, and I kind of obviously find that a very seductive argument. It makes sense to me intellectually, but I think the thing that I found sort of that didn't quite work for me about it was that it felt like, well, okay, actually intellectually knowing that or intellectually understanding that isn't really a cure. Yes. And like it's very possible to know that and kind of understand that and still feel depressed and not be able to do the kinds of activities that might help to create a world where the social conditions were less misery making or cause less distress. And so I wouldn't want to say that I'm kind of trying to overturn this sort of understanding of the psyche as being kind of shaped by people's social experiences. Obviously, I agree with that, but I guess I just felt like, well, what's the solution to me feels like a lot more complicated. And so then I was kind of stuck trying to think about, well, what is then the relationship between politics and depression, and I found it in the end I ended up just describing my own experience of being depressed as a starting point, just because I felt like there was something about the subjective experience of depression that I could articulate from my own experience of it precisely feeling completely causeless, and also kind of and at the point that I talk about in the book, I was very familiar with these kind of left-wing arguments about the psyche, and that that didn't make me feel any better, and so I think I was that was my sort of starting point. And in terms of the kind of the sort of the books that I talk about, or the kind of case studies in that chapter, I'd always known when I started writing this book that I was really interested in the relationship between two books by the radical feminist Shulamith Firestone. So her 1970 polemic, The Dialectic of Sex, published in 1970, and then her only other book, which was published in 97, Airless Spaces. And the kind of, I was interested in the sort of really extreme difference between these two books, one of which is sort of incredibly polemical, reaching towards the future, full of a very sort of like energized book that also sort of emerges from a kind of collective political experience from the women's liberation movement, and she was also involved in the New Left before that, and then contrasting it with this. It's kind of like an semi-autobiographical novel with very, very slim and incredibly, it's called Airless Spaces, and it's an incredibly airless book. Yeah. And I think I was always kind of, I suppose when I started thinking about the relationship between them, I wanted to think about almost the Airless Spaces as almost like a response to an political experience, but in a way the book didn't allow me to do that, because it's almost too closed in on itself. There's not really and so again, I think for me that was like trying to kind of grapple with these two books and think about them was also helpful for trying to think about sometimes it's not quite as easy as it's possible to make a sort of intellectual argument, but I felt like again here there was something so profound about the depression that actually it wasn't very easy to read it in this kind of political contextualized way, if that makes sense.
I think it's interesting too. I think that the depression chapter was in some ways about feminism, right? That it was because I think a lot of the discourse around this stuff gets to be like, it's really gendered, right? It's like, oh, talking about feelings is for girls and talking about yourself is for girls, basically. And it's sort of unserious in this way that, I'll have other thoughts on that. But I think one of the reasons that I ended up writing about myself in my book was like, I was doing this as mostly like a work of present day journalism. So I'm talking to people about horrible things that happen to them and people that they've lost. And I felt like I couldn't do that from like I'm an objective journalist and I'm not going to tell you anything about me, because I just felt like a vampire, that there was something about like, if I'm going to share all of these incredibly vulnerable moments and ask people to share them with me, like the way that I did that was to tell them my story.
Yeah.
And here's why I'm here and interested in this in the first place. It's not just like academic to me. I'm not an academic, but you know what I mean? It's actually personal, and therefore like I have to sort of be as vulnerable as anyone else. Which is tough. It's tough,
it feels
right?
It feels like, I guess, I think for me it also, there was something almost perverse about writing a book about it. We should think about feelings, and like the personal really is political.
Yeah.
And then it just be like sort of this kind of impersonal force. That's sort of so bizarre.
Yeah, it just becomes really strange, right? And also, it's oddly terrifying. On a sort of related note, there's a lot of pressure when you put a book out in the world to be like, oh, you're happy, you're excited, you're thrilled to be here, all of this. And one of the things I've had to hold about this book is like, it's not going to make me happy. It's not like a happy book. It contains within it like the 6 worst years of my life. And not that everything in the last 6 years has been like unmitigatedly horrible, but like the worst things that have ever happened to me have happened to me in the course of writing this book, and most of them are in that book. And so being able to sort of say that without taking anything away from like, no, I think it's a good book. I wouldn't put it out there if I didn't think it was good and worth reading, but like it doesn't make me happy and I don't feel great about it. And so part of this is just very selfish of me. And I'm like, how has it been for you to have this book moving through the world? And have you had like similar feelings about it?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point. And I have to say, like, I was really dreading it coming out in a way. And I think because I was like, wow, it was hard enough to sit and think about these materials and think about these kind of depressing topics. And now I have to kind of go and talk about it. But I have to say, there was quite a gap between when I finished writing the book and when it came out. I wrote it mostly in lockdown. And so it was really the product of like into isolation. And I think actually for me, it has been really quite amazing bringing it into dialogue with other people, not like because I get to talk, but because it's been so interesting hearing what other people bring of their own experiences from contexts that I'm completely unfamiliar with. And I think I found that actually really kind of incredible. Like I've learned so much, I think, from being in dialogue with people, and sort of it's really felt like it's kind of expanded it in ways that I'm like, yeah, this is also why. Yeah, in a way, it feels like the kind of nice antidote to writing something in such isolation, and almost like, I don't know, I feel like I have a tendency in those times as well to become quite kind of almost like have quite a paranoiac relationship to it's, I don't know, like so for me it's been really, I mean, obviously it's also hard talking about really difficult subjects, and sometimes I have found myself getting even publicly upset, which is a weird experience and not something that I'm very accustomed to. But I think overall, it's been just kind of quite nourishing, and it feels like, now I'm like, oh god, I could write a much better book now. like I actually talk to all these people and learn a lot more.
Yeah. Well, maybe that'll actually like inform this next question then, because I'm sort of returning back to the thing I was saying about this, like, just snap out of it, advice, response to depression, response to sort of affect, and in general, that is, this unseriousness of feeling. And, your book begins and ends with this call to take this emotional fallout of defeat seriously and to understand like how that affects everything we do. I wonder if you've actually, thought about this more since you've been talking to people about this. Like how do we sort of avoid this, like, just snap out of it and go back to organizing advice? Especially, I think, because for me, like as you were saying, the isolation of writing feels very real. And in some ways, I am always excited to like get back out of the writing phase and go back to being a journalist and going back to like talking to people. But still, it doesn't solve everything.
Yeah. And I mean, in some ways, I think I felt kind of, my book doesn't really have many answers. It just sort of proposes. I mean, it's more like, here are some examples from history, and also here are some questions or some contradictions that are maybe in some ways not that easy to resolve. And I feel like in a way, I'm okay with that. I think that sometimes maybe it's just important. I'm not saying that we need to all just sit around and talk about our feelings. And
no,
just do that, and that should take precedence over, actually getting out and doing political organizing. Obviously, I don't think that, but I think for anyone who's done any been involved in political organizing or been involved in any kind of like big kind of movements, I think that people recognize generally that these things can be very emotionally sticky and messy and difficult, and obviously also incredibly emotionally transformative in positive ways that also change people forever. And I don't think it's melodramatic to say that. I think that's also the case. And that's almost like precisely why they can also be so difficult and damaging. And I think, I don't know, it just seemed to me so obvious that this was something that people historically had experienced in men, not to kind of generalize and be like all the experiences are the same, but it did just seem like it was present, even for people who rhetorically would be quite dismissive of sitting around talking about your feelings. It's kind of, I think there is evidence of, even among people whose own kind of public pronouncements on these things would have been quite dismissive of thinking about feelings, and certainly of kind of therapy and these kinds of things. So yeah, I guess I just felt like it's important to kind of just be honest about that and try to sort of think about like, well, how did people understand their own experiences?
I mean, in a way, it's an admission that like the self is always constructed and transformed socially, right? That rather than this sort of individual therapeutic idea that we just need to like heal ourselves and get back to the self that we were, rather it's, that we are transformed by these moments and then transformed again in ways that maybe we weren't ready for. I write in mine, I'm just like, I'm not the person that I was 6 years ago before like my father died and my life was turned upside down. But it's also true that like I'm not the same person that I was before Occupy Wall Street or before the 2020 George Floyd uprisings, right? That there are moments that like fundamentally change how you relate to the world and to other people, that we just sort of aren't the same. And that, rather than a sort of individualist bourgeois indulgence, is actually deeply important to the project of socialism or anything that we might, want to see in a just world.
Yeah, and those experiences are as much interpersonal as they are personal, or the personal is always interpersonal, as well as being always political. And I suppose, there's something about, like you say, you're not the person that you were before, and maybe there's certain experiences of being in kind of political struggle that can kind of, I'm not only interested in defeat, but I think that I'm also interested in sort of ongoingness and kind of sort of day to day. But I think one thing that I was interested in is a sort of the kind of return to the sort of routine when there has been an experience, kind of almost like a ruptural moment or a glimpse of a possible otherwise, and then what happens when that gets kind of shut down and people are kind of back again in their, oh well, we're just kind of back in. And obviously being, and for many people it can be actually, in cases of like severe political repression, it might be much worse than it was before. So I think I think those were all things that I was trying to think about.
Yeah, I was struck by at the end when you bring in the miners' strike, and particularly the experience of like the miners' wives, right? Because the mines were such a gender segregated world. And this came up, I've got some stuff about the miners' strike in my book too. And people said the same thing. They were like, there were a lot of divorces after the miners' strike. Like a lot of these women who were completely politically transformed by this, standing up for their miner husbands, then ended up leaving them because they couldn't sort of fit back into the people that they were now didn't fit into that very specific gender segregated world in the same way. And I just found that such a fascinating story that like, I don't think we hear enough. So I loved that you brought it in there, and the stories are so good.
Yeah, totally. Because those kind of, I guess, like the sort of infrastructures of solidarity or whatever you would call them that sprung in support of the strike. Yeah, like lots of women whose lives previously would have been very much within the home, and suddenly found themselves in this kind of social world, and also taking on public, speaking publicly or traveling or meeting people from different solidarity movements. And so it was a kind of really like an opening up to the world in a certain
and even
way.
running from the cops.
Indeed.
Yeah, they're such good stories. I love them so much. Yeah, so a mantra that I sort of spontaneously came out with at some point after Trump was elected the first time, hopefully the only time, in 2016, was resist the pleasures of doom. But I think the thing that your book is about in so many ways is like facing the unpleasure of doom. And this sort of realities of the incomplete revolution. And as you said, there's this, you're interested in the going on, because I think that like giving up completely is very seductive, that there's something almost relaxing about the idea that like we're fucked, so we might as well just like party while the world burns or turn into a fascist. I'm not naming names. So, but I wonder if you have thoughts on some of the various pleasures of doom that you, I think, are doing a really good job in this book of like picking your way around.
Yeah, I love that phrase. I think it's very helpful. I mean, I remember actually in that kind of 2016 moment feeling kind of confused also when I felt like there was this kind of like there was this kind of libidinal energy, I guess, like a kind of jouissance that some people on the left had about following
Yes.
the kind of, like, you know, people would be like, I've been up until 4 a.m. reading like Reddit threads of like, you know, kind of getting really, well, and if obviously you can say like, oh, that's because you want to understand, you know, white supremacy in order to destroy it. But then there's also like these kind of, I think there are these kind of peculiar, there's kind of a peculiar energy, I think, that can sometimes come from these kinds of fascinations with, and maybe this is something that Naomi Klein's book talks about, the doppelganger book, in some ways, this kind of, that kind of energizing thing of like how you can sort of engage with your enemy. And yeah, I suppose, I was definitely thinking about the unpleasure of doom, and I think I did want to really not gloss over how unpleasurable it is, and not kind of, I got kind of really allergic at one point to reading books that would describe negative emotions as generative, and I think at some, and I don't want to be kind of churlish. I'm sure there are obviously very valuable arguments to be made about that, but I think I was like, no, sometimes it's just bad. It's not generative, and it's not, and that's just a kind of a reality. And that's sort of, I wanted to kind of confront that, I think, and take it seriously. But I think, I know, because I have been kind of talking to people a bit about the book now, and something that a few people have asked me about is, you know, there aren't really examples in the book of people who, you know, gave up completely or like, turned to the right, for example. And I guess it was in some ways like a repression on my part. Like I was like, I don't want to think about that, maybe. And I don't know. I think, and it's not a question that I found very easy to answer, because I think people were like, why didn't you talk about that? And like my only answer was like, I didn't want to, I guess. Like it's not really like a good like intellectual answer. It's just like I personally didn't want to go there. Although
I also think it's silly to pick on books for what's not in them, because like, well, you want that book, go write that book. Like there are many books left to be written. I only had so many words, and my editor's always trying to cut them on me. So you know, there are limits.
Exactly, no book can be about all things, and it's not exactly. It's a bit of a paranoid reading kind of practice, I guess, to always be like, why didn't you talk about this? But I mean, it is in some ways an interesting question, because I wasn't that conscious of not doing it, I suppose. It
makes me think about, I read this book years ago, did an interview with the author that was called Exit Right, and it was on like these 4 or 5 major figures on like the American right who had started out on the left. It was like Whittaker Chambers and what's his face? Oh my God, why am I blanking on his name? It's okay. They're not actually that important. Forget all the neoliberals. But yeah, I mean, that is one way that people give up, certainly. And, you know, sometimes people exit right, and I'm like, yeah, saw that one coming. And other times you're very surprised by it. But yeah, I suppose it's sort of natural to want to join the winning team in some ways. You know, I can make some morbid jokes about that, but like, there is something to like dust yourself off and try again, in the immortal words of Aaliyah. But also, I don't know, I have this conversation with sort of older mentors, the people that I refer to like as my labor movement moms and dads and aunties and uncles, about, like the way they have to sort of tell people like, well, we tried that, 20 years ago, we tried that, because the left doesn't like to write about its failures. It doesn't like to write about losses. This is why there's like not really a good book on Operation Dixie in the US, or like, and that like after the Corbyn project, we didn't get a lot of good sort of postmortems on what happened, really. And the same with Bernie Sanders. It just sort of moved on to like, this is how we win next. And yeah, I guess I did, come to the point of thinking like we really have to start writing about this stuff. Although my book is a bit more about like grief, as in like, somebody you love has died, you have lost something very significant to you, and then that moves people to be politicized. But obviously the loss of a political movement is a very important kind of grief, and I also just kind of chose not to write about it, but I'm glad that you did.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of political movements do also involve grief and actual people dying, and that, yeah. So yeah, it's kind of also kind of folded into it.
Yeah, and it's obviously one of the experiences of defeat, right? Is literally like what has happened to get us to defeat. And we're not just talking about electoral defeat, but the defeat of actual revolutions and uprisings and things like. Yeah, we're talking about torture and murders and all sorts of fun things. I'm fun at parties these days. But yeah, this one theme that comes up over and over and over again in your book is this question of time. And I think that was probably, the sense of urgency, I'm sure, was there for everybody that you're writing about in this book. But I think a lot of us feel like that clock is ticking really down to apocalypse with climate change. And also just how bad things are right now, and the Labour Party voting, against overturning the 2-child benefit cap. But, we also can't rush things, as Jane McAlevey, speaking of people who we have lost recently and that I really miss, so memorably wrote and reminded us over and over and over again, there are no shortcuts. But also that people need to heal and recover and figure out a new plan and do it strategically, and not just, charging back out and doing the same thing over again. And I feel like you sort of, you rephrase it and rephrase it and rephrase it, and eventually sort of get to urgency requires patience, which I just loved. And so, of course, this comes down to being an organizing question again. But like, I've been thinking a lot about how we create structures that allow that patience, that allow people time off. When one of the things you write about really well in this book is the way that some of these organizations really ended up sort of eating themselves with the opposite of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was one of the kind of preoccupations that I had. And interestingly, I think, I became interested in the sort of the kind of conflict between urgency and patience. We absolutely must act now. There's so much that absolutely has to change immediately. And yet so much, I think about thinking about kind of psychic life especially does seem to require, taking things a bit more slowly. So there's a sort of there's two sort of paces, basically. One that would require being very, very, very quick, and one that is demanding, if not exactly slowness, then certainly slowing down, or kind of and again, I think that somehow also almost like maps onto a kind of reform revolution sort of, I think this kind of conflict between urgency and patience, which in some ways I think thought of it as the external world is demanding urgency while the internal world of the subject is demanding patience. I mean, that's too simplistic, because I think
right, exactly.
obviously it's always both. And I think, yeah, that and I suppose when I suppose when this book was first coming out, in the aftermath of October 7th, and thinking about the genocide, it suddenly feels like, oh, this is like the last, like, why write a stupid book about sitting around thinking about your feelings? Everything is so urgent. But obviously the struggle for Palestinian liberation is a long one, and has required patience. And so I think it's like a lot of these kinds of, which isn't to detract from the absolute necessity to do things kind of right now. I feel like, again, it's one of these things that's like a contradiction that I don't think it's possible to sort of resolve, but I think it felt important to kind of pose, because I think this sort of phrase, urgency requires patience. It's that, if you don't actually build in sort of structures of care within movements, for example, and kind of attempt to sort of build in some sort of times and spaces for kind of reflection and healing. I mean, sometimes that feels like that in itself is almost like requires so much political transformation in advance that, again, you get kind of tangled up in these sorts of questions, like what order do things have to happen in a way. It's like already that feels like, well, you already have to kind of have solved a lot of problems to have the luxury to have these kinds of things, if you see what I mean. So I get kind of tangled up in those sorts of questions.
No, it's always dialectical, isn't it? The thing that I think when you said reflection there, I was just like, right, like, because I think, again, as I said, I feel like there is a lot of, in recent years, sort of not pausing to think about, like, okay, why did we just lose and how did we just lose? But just sort of hurling ourselves at the wall again. And while, like, I think, as my friend Rodrigo Nunes would remind us, that we're always going to be on some level hurling things at the wall to see what sticks. He puts it much more eloquently that I'm sorry, darling. But, like, on another level, like, to do things well and strategically and with the kind of ruthless criticism of everything existing that Marx would remind us to do, that does require reflection, and that does in turn require a kind of patience to say, like, okay, what happened here? And that, how did that break down? And, like, those breakdowns have real human consequences, right? Like, I have not woken up a day since October 7th without thinking that, like, our inability to make the genocide machine stop is just horrific consequences that I'm only experiencing through this thing, But at the same time, it has now been most of a year, and we have had to learn to sort of live with the unlivable in order to keep going. But that it's a patience that isn't acceptance, I guess, is what I'm thinking about here. That is not like, okay, this is just how things are. And, it's not like some Marxist version of the Serenity Prayer. But it is saying that, like, as you were saying, it's not just that, like, our frail human bodies need patience and the movement needs urgency, but the movement also needs patience, and reflection and strategic thought takes time.
I think that's it. And maybe another contradiction that I think about in relation to that is like it's simultaneously necessary to really kind of, like, lots of people on social media, which is how, like, I'm consuming these horrors, is kind of, don't look away. And, like, but I guess it's like, again, it's like how much can people, again, it's like getting a kind of, it's important to really kind of feel open to the horrors of the world. But it's also necessary to kind of not completely collapse. And again, there's not like a science to that. That's really hard to do both. I don't know. It's not like an easy answer to that. But I think it is dangerous to sort of like close oneself off to the horrors completely.
I spent a lot of time sort of picking at and thinking about this idea of watching, and Zoe Samudzi, among other people, writes sort of beautifully about like this compulsion to watch, and the weird pleasures of feeling like watching is enough, which I suppose is an extra danger of the social media age, right? That like just bearing witness to children with horrific injuries in Gaza is not sufficient. It's not activism. It's not like solving the thing. And as a journalist, I'm incredibly aware that like just making people aware of things doesn't actually solve shit. And that's just sort of the reality of it. So we're starting to get some listener questions, which thank you guys. And some of them overlap with things that I had on my list. So I'm going to blend a couple of them into my questions. Because the next place that I was going was trauma, which was also the question from this listener who writes, trauma has become something of a hot topic in activist, especially online activist circles, often expressed as trauma-informed politics or similar things. But isn't this a very contradictory thing to form the foundation of our politics, contradictory as its responses can be? And like when I was thinking about trauma, and particularly in your trauma chapter, I think I noted that like I like trauma better as an explanation for sort of mental unwellness than biochemistry, which is the other really hot one these days, right? That everything is just neural pathways, because trauma does have a material and social component to it, right? Something happened to us, something happened to me. But of course, since we were just talking about Palestine, like the way you bring in, and of course you wrote this before October 7th, but like the way you bring in the ongoing trauma, right? How do we deal with trauma, heal from trauma when the trauma doesn't end? So that's a whole bunch that I just threw at you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the question in the chat as well. I mean, it actually makes me think about the argument that the kind of argument that Wendy Brown makes, kind of the danger of sort of over-identifying with one's own woundedness.
Yes.
Which isn't something that I really talk about in the book, but I wonder, it feels like it maybe speaks to something about how, there's a kind of, this can be a kind of maybe a danger in certain ways of thinking about experiences of trauma. I think in my book, I'm trying to distinguish between PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a diagnostic category, which is in some ways kind of tied to the biochemical, and sort of trauma more broadly. And it's a very complicated, knotty topic. And I think that, there's a huge scholarship on the history of PTSD, and PTSD has been defined and redefined across different, editions of the DSM. So it's one of those things that's quite tricky to get into, especially because it obviously involves sort of reckoning with such extreme experiences. I talk in the book about the example of some psychiatrists who were working in Chile with victims of repression and the Pinochet regime, who came to reject the category PTSD. And that was partly because, it doesn't, I mean, and this, I think, ties in with some of the conversation about mourning in the book as well, that okay, well, what do you do with an experience that the psychic distress is caused by something that happened in the past, but the social injustice that kind of caused that thing is still ongoing. And so I think, some critics of PTSD sort of say that one of the problems with it is that it fails to distinguish very carefully between victim and perpetrator. So yes, the traumatic event happens in and outside, but the kind of the sort of power asymmetries and sort of causes and questions of sort of justice and injustice get kind of left out there. So, for example, I live in Scotland, and here there was a man called Shekabayu who was killed by the police, and the two cops that were meant to kind of stand trial for his murder both got diagnosed with PTSD, and they didn't have to take a stand. And so, like, you can see how also the diagnosis can kind of have this sort of so I think I'm kind of, but I think that this question about, is it contradictory to form the foundation of our politics on questions of trauma, is a really, really good one. And I think, it does make me think about that kind of the argument that Wendy Brown makes about the dangers of like identifying too heavily with one's own woundedness or something.
Yeah, well, there's also a way that like, and I've written about this a few times, that like there's a, among the modern left, a way of talking about like the workers as though they're always somebody over there. And particularly to talk about like low wage workers, migrants, a certain set of people who are sort of always already configured as victims, as traumatized, as whatever. And then there's like sort of the other people over here. And it is often true that like a lot of people who are getting through the day, living through shit that I can't imagine, frankly, and are also coming up with organizing strategies that are just like absolutely incredible in response to the, various traumas of their everyday lives, right? And so I guess the question is like, again, do we conceive of trauma as like, this is my personal thing that I need to recover from? Because like sometimes it's also that, but also like we live in a world where, hundreds of people are crammed into the bottom of a fishing boat to try to get to the EU, away from wars and climate change that the European countries have caused, or the US, to be fair to my people. And that is a horrific world. And so like on that level, like, yes, it is the foundation of our politics. I want a world where that doesn't happen anymore, right? And I'm thinking back to, Engels on the condition of the working class in England, right? Like, yes, we want a world where people don't live like that. And also where cops don't kill people. And, at the same time, like, there's the sort of oppression Olympics. One of the other questions in here is something about, does the internet help or hurt processing and recovering from the emotional experience of defeat? And I just think of some of these like awful sort of internet pylons where like, there's either like, on the one hand, the competition to be like the most oppressed and therefore you can't possibly criticize me. And on the other hand, it's, in defense of whichever person we've cathected onto this week. And yeah, there's a wounded attachments, right, is the Wendy Brown phrase. And I think that's a very evocative one.
Yeah. And I suppose in a sense, then it's not, it doesn't I don't think that the argument would then contradict what you're saying. It's like those traumas are precisely the starting point, or like the horrific difficulties and distresses that people experience in their lives because of the way the world is structured, absolutely shouldn't exist. And I suppose that's because, and that just requires then the issue would be to start from there with the hope of then eradicating a world in which those kinds of things exist. And so then the problem, I suppose, that she would be pointing to is when those kinds of things become too fixed.
Yes. And I think that the thing that I'm sort of trying to allude to is this tendency to assume that like once people are traumatized, they are therefore no longer capable of being political subjects, right? That like the two things don't happen simultaneously, that if we are traumatized, we must be sort of wrapped in cotton wool and protected from the world, rather than like if we are, like so many of the people that I spoke to who had been involved in the movement for Black Lives, right? And people who had lost family members to police, and like, those are horrific traumas, and that brought them into the street and turned their lives absolutely upside down, in a way that has been like incredibly powerful and transformative, and has been transformative for other people. The most recent example I've been thinking about is Philando Castile, right, who was a cafeteria worker in Minnesota who was killed by police in 2016. And after he died, there was this outpouring of love from his school community because he used to like buy the kids lunch out of his own pocket. And so his mom took up this issue of school lunch debt. And now, because of her and because of her campaign, the entire state of Minnesota has free school lunches for everyone.
Wow.
You know, and it's like, it's almost like too cute a story. Like when you say it like that, you're like, aw, but also like, my God, if I had watched my son's murder on Facebook Live, I don't think I would get out of bed for 6 years, let alone like have, you know, help transform the politics of a state.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of this kind of question, I suppose, about the relationship between mourning and militancy. In a sense, it's like, to what extent can mourning can sort of convert grief into a sort of righteous anger, repress processes of mourning, or to what extent can it also be a way of actually acting to transform the world to make it less kind of damaging for others, is actually in itself can be part of a process of mourning, in a sense.
Yeah. And we have brought ourselves to one of the other questions, which was, how do you think we should relate to grief as a political force? And I think there's this real tension, as you write about the ACT UP and the AIDS movement, and like this both like incredible power of mourning and organizing. In my book, I sort of play a little bit with like the Joe Hill "Don't Mourn, Organize" versus the Mother Jones "Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living." And I must say I like the Mother Jones one, but because I think there is a space for remembrance and grieving, and that being a thing that we deserve sort of time to take. And also that like demanding that time in itself, and this is where I get all Walter Benjamin and talk about the emergency brake, right? That like the revolution is sometimes humans grabbing for the emergency brake and making the whole damn thing stop. And when you think of a strike or an uprising like the ones we had after George Floyd was killed, they are a stopping of things as an action, right? As like a hugely important, powerful, militant action of grinding an entire city to a halt, whether that is by setting a police station on fire or by, shutting down every public school in Chicago, or shutting down the port of Liverpool, or, any number of other things, shutting down all the coal mines in the country. That reminds me of sort of the power of stopping, that I think can be part of grief, that can be useful, to sort of consider, like, what does militant mourning look like? What does urgent patience look like? Sometimes it looks like the moment when, like, bringing everything to a stop and demanding attention to the thing. I'm thinking of everybody who was getting arrested yesterday trying to stop Benjamin Netanyahu from getting into Congress.
Yeah, I think this question of sort of opening up, because it's sort of the tension between mourning and militancy is in a sense, if the social world is still, inflicting more loss, then it's not possible to stop and mourn. And mourning isn't just something that happened in the past, which I guess it's something that's kind of still ongoing. And so I think I actually was talking, maybe something that I hadn't thought about enough in the book was the idea that also, like, mourning is often the occasion for protest, for militancy. People obviously, someone at a talk I gave was referring to, the 2022 uprisings in Iran, which literally was at a funeral. It was at Amini's funeral that kind of uprising started, and police repression was of mourners. And so I guess it's like, it is not just a question that's somehow about, mourning the loss of a movement, or mourning the loss of, common who were repressed as the result of it's kind of that there are forms of militancy that respond to
right.
So I guess these questions sort of maybe the more I think about it, the more it feels like there's lots of different ways in which militancy sort of is mourning in some way, or can be.
I loved the bit where you wrote about Patrice Lumumba's widow leading this march, and that was just a really striking bit. I'm also thinking, so I had turned in a draft of my book on September 15th, and then of course October 7th happened, and I ripped a big chunk of it out and wrote about everything that was going on in Gaza for, well, at the time I had like 3 months. But what I had written about Palestine before included Shireen Abu Akleh's funeral, right, which was also attacked by police. And her coffin was like thrown to the ground because the police broke up this funeral because that was a moment of gathering. It was seen as political and had to be broken up. And so, I think that grief is terrifying. Or of course, the one we always think about is Emmett Till's mother, right? That Mamie Till Mobley insisted on having the casket open so that people could see what had been done. And like, we can think about sort of the awful limitations of that, which is that lynchings haven't stopped. But also the fact that we all know that name, right? And then it did galvanize a whole bunch of people into organizing. So since we're talking about grief, I do want to kick Freud's corpse around a little bit. Poor Siggy. Because one thing we very much agree on is that Freud gets mourning so wrong. And I focus sort of on the question of letting go and his lack of attention to the future. But you really focus in on this question of reality and like the reality testing in order to get over things. So I wonder if I could get you to draw that out a little bit more while we're talking about grief.
Yeah, so I guess I was really struck by this line from an essay by Jacqueline Rose where she's like, Freud's definition of mourning is so weirdly like not very typical of a psychoanalyst, in that he's basically like, mourning has a beginning, a middle, of an end. It ends according to him, which is very like un-Freud in a way. Then it's like, oh, you do just, if in what he calls normal mourning, which he contrasts to pathological melancholia, that is a process with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I suppose for me, the question of reality is related, I think, to questions of temporality, because, he's sort of assuming a kind of individual mourner mourning a lost object in the past, and then coming to terms with that loss in a present, which is kind of just treated as a sort of reality, as just this sort of neutral, empirical, existing world. But if in fact, the loss that is being mourned was caused by a reality that's anything but neutral, that continues to be violent and unjust, then obviously it's not possible to just come to terms with the loss, because the world still is inflicting more loss. And so I think that's kind of, in a sense, where this question of his idea of sort of reality testing and a notion of reality, it's like, well, what reality, and like, why should we come to terms with reality if reality means like the social world in which we live? So I think I guess it was like, on the one hand, I was sort of suspicious of the sort of neatness of the idea of a mourning that ends, but also I think this kind of inattention, I guess, to like, what is reality, and like maybe I really loved that. I think the thing that I mean, there were many things that bothered me about it, but one of them is also this idea that like mourning is a process of sort of detaching from the lost object. He writes about object as though he's not mostly talking about people. And I have a sidebar, which is, I think that's much more appropriate about like a breakup than it is about a death. But anyway, this idea that like it is proper and good to sort of detach and let go.
Yeah, it is both sort of, as you note, very like unpsychoanalytic, and also just like it's such an odd command, and yet it feels like the one the world makes of you all the time when you're grieving. That like because it's messy and because it takes too long, and because it doesn't happen on a clock and it sort of has its own temporality to it, that like one of the reasons that I was relating to Hannah's book so intensely while I was reading it was I was just like, the reason I write this book about grief is my father died 6 years ago, and it was, as we would say, like sort of a normal death. I mean, he had been ill off and on for many years. He was a lifelong smoker, so that'll kill you. So will capitalism. But the way it upended my life, I was completely like, thrown by. And then I was just struck by how like nobody could deal with it unless they had been through something similar. And that it would just not happen on the time frame that you thought. So it's like, oh, I'll take this much time off so I can like deal with it. Be a nice Jewish girl and sit Shiva for a week, right? But like the fact is that like it comes back still, and I've been in it like the last couple of weeks. I just felt like I was thrown back into 2018, and like that it's physical, like the materiality of it. I think gets missed. The fact that like it literally affected how my heart beat and how I breathed, and that those things, far from being sort of individual and specific, are actually like incredibly common and universal. That we all die and we all grieve, and we don't all grieve the same, but we all will be transformed by it at some point. And that, again, that I think there's something deeply sort of collective and material about it, rather than sort of individual and idealistic, to say that like these are things that tie us all together. Actually, these are ways that we can figure out how to connect with each other, rather than just like, you know, disconnect from this thing and go back to work.
Yeah, and I suppose the temporality of grief is kind of anathema to capitalist temporality in a way, or the demands of capitalism makes on people to, you know, have a tiny amount of time off if you're lucky. And like you're saying, it's not a linear process either. I was actually really struck. A couple of people had mentioned to me how a kind of a loss of in that, you know, of a parent or of someone very close, had somehow felt like it did then, even if that in itself wasn't kind of it didn't feel like political with a capital P. It became kind of folded into other experiences, informed other experiences, and also enabled a kind of opening up onto the world or something.
Yes.
Which, as you said, is not. Yeah, like it doesn't kind of divorce one from like everyone else. It's kind of precisely like a kind of something that's sort of an emotional opening up in certain ways. And that there are things about those feelings that might not seem at first glance kind of very obviously political, but that still have a kind of
So my favorite line in your book, and there are several that I've already quoted, but the one that I swear I'm going to tattoo across my chest is, but isn't materialist reality also soft? And I was just like, you know, because I again, like I you know, and some of this is gendered, like hard, as well as I would say, like, how psychoanalytic do we want to get here when we talk about like, why does everyone assume the revolution has to be so hard?
Yeah, I mean, that passage comes in, I'm talking about, so there's a chapter in the book called Bitterness, which was my attempt. I really wanted to talk about the kind of interpersonal problems that can come up in groups. So it's not, unlike the other chapters, it's much more about interpersonal dynamics than it is about, you know, particular kinds of feelings. And I talk about the self-criticism practices, the pretty brutal ones that were practiced by the Weather Underground in the US. And this is a very extreme version of a practice that has many different kinds of forms and can be, in fact, fairly soft in certain iterations. But I was looking at like what happens when something becomes a kind of very extreme form of dogmatism and kind of political purity. It's demanded of the self and others, and a sort of berating set. And there's these kind of incredible quotes from people who are like, we said we had to be like a hammer, like a tool, like an anvil, like literally like bits
just say like a penis, guys, just say it.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like hyper masculine.
Yeah.
It's like, in order to wield weapons, you have to like be a weapon, basically. And so there's something that's kind of so sort of like almost like just so absurd about it, because it's so extreme, and like also being like very, very cruel to one another in the process. And then, you know, obviously they weren't hammers and anvils and weapons, they were people, and so actually it was really horrible and upsetting, and like it, you know, didn't go that well. And so I guess, yeah, this kind of, I think I kind of was reading it, and it's like it felt like, yeah, there was somehow, and again I think this goes back to your question earlier about, oh, why is it seen that thinking about feelings is somehow sort of associated with, you know, oh, silly women's things or whatever. And I think in this it was like, it felt like materialism and a kind of a commitment to, well, historical materialism and a particular form of sort of political struggle was sort of automatically aligned with hardness. And so I think that my kind of somewhat kind of joking line, like, well, isn't material reality also soft? Because it's like, isn't that also a kind of part of materialism? And I think was kind of a response to that, like it kind of like, well, why are you saying that why are you equating these things? Yeah, and I suppose it sort of, for me, feels like it, I was trying to think about kind of, yeah, like almost like, yeah, vulnerability and sort of porosity, and how to combine those kinds of quite sort of vulnerable emotional ways of being with a kind of quite militant politics. And that, again, I think that's a contradiction, but I think it's important, you know, not to try and become hammers.
Well, also, you know, it didn't lead to good politics, right? It's not like, oh, they were all incredibly successful and then they just, you know, all got sad because they were being too mean to each other. It's like the Weather Underground, like, you know, basically only successfully blew up themselves. You know, and that, like, and it's funny because of course Bill Ayers now is just like the sweetest man ever, and is like a primary school teacher, you know, and it's like, talk about somebody who's embraced softness. He's just a lovely human. And you know, you think of this, again, this wave at like, it's not actually that considering the harm they were doing to each other was like the one contradiction to their otherwise perfect politics. It was actually that, like, this obsession with hardness, just like it recreates sort of the worst things about capitalist structures in the name of overthrowing them. And like, I am not going to say that like we're not going to need to use some of the master's tools to dismantle his house, with apologies to Audre Lorde, but like, there is something about that I just like sort of push back against really intensely. And, you know, one of our listener questions is also like, one of the tensions of taking up psychological or emotional categories in political analysis is that they tend to push things towards the individual level. And I just think like that's not true. I think that specifically by saying that like political defeat has many different types of common affect and effects on us, right? That is actually noting that these issues aren't simply individual, that they might affect each of us sort of individually in different ways, that like my response to the Corbyn loss isn't the same as yours, isn't the same as various other friends and comrades of mine. But it is to say that it like shook everybody who was even, you know, as tangentially involved in it as I was, really deeply, even if we on some level knew it was coming. And rather than saying that's individual, I'm saying that like one of the worst things that happened was that then COVID happened and we were all just locked in our rooms and alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that was one of precisely, I think, that's kind of one of the things that the book is trying to think through, because I think that experience, for all that it might have been experienced by lots of different people kind of in their own ways, and that it might have gone from people meeting up collectively to then being quite atomized, like in the aftermath of the, that there's also a shared experience, and there was, that might not be exactly collective in the sense of like people all meeting up in one room to talk about it, but I think it is a shared experience, and it is like it's easy as it's possible as well to sort of like name its external cause in a political world. And so I think again, it's which is not to say that everyone feels everything exactly the same way, but I think you're right to kind of push back on that, the idea that the psychological or the emotional is necessarily always about the individual, or certainly not about like an individuated individual, if that makes sense. Kind of like totally
flipping to another aspect of the individualism question, actually, because you write fairly early on in the book about revolutionary nostalgia and its tendency to turn people into myths. Not that long ago, actually right after the Queen of England died, I was at this retreat with people, and we got into like a deep discussion about the Lenin's corpse and how it is preserved and why it is preserved and how deeply creepy and weird that is, and also like fairly un-Leninist. But also, of course, this sort of, preservation happens while people are still alive, where they're either treated as like fully perfect and untouchable, or they fall, which actually I think connects to the question of trashing and social media, which also some of our listeners asked about, and the tribalism of today's politics. Or we have these sort of melancholic attachments. I think of Bernie would have won, sorry guys, as this kind of like, okay, but he didn't, so we got to deal with the reality that we're in. That these sort of, this is our new hero, this one's going to save us. I was talking to the brilliant and amazing Alex Press today about this really necessary piece that she wrote at Jacobin about Sean O'Brien from the Teamsters speaking at the RNC with Donald Trump. And and she noted that some people were not pleased that she wrote him. I was like, well, it was necessary to write, because this is, if we can't actually talk honestly about what's happening, that's not a sign of confidence and power. That's a sign of defeat. That's a lack of faith in precisely the thing that, again, that I keep going back to here, that like the capacity of ordinary people to change the world, not for Bernie Sanders to be the only one who can do it, or Sean O'Brien, or, any number of other people.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think the person that like Mao used to have, like there was like a special train that Mao's corpse would get, because like the corpse preservation experts were like, the ones that did Lenin, and so then Mao would get sent, and I think Ho Chi Minh is also preserved.
Yes, yeah,
And
that's so weird.
Buried. But he was also preserved, but then I guess now that like he doesn't get like top ups, presumably he's so it's slightly
oh my god, that's so good. That's so good.
Invented the sorry, this is like total like.
No, I love this. Go on. I'm obsessed.
The guy that invented the
you have to hear about now.
Also preserved. So it had a museum, and I think it was, I don't know if it still exists, but yeah, he had his own museum where he was preserved, the guy that invented preserving the corpses. Anyway, I mean, it's obviously like the most sort of bizarre, like back to front metaphor for like a vibrant and vital revolution is like literally a dead body. It's like, what? I mean, that's so bizarre and sort of back to front. And I think, I guess, I'm kind of, I sort of think about this kind of question, I suppose, like the very opening pages of my book. I sort of start with the sort of ideal of sort of revolutionary self-sacrifice, and there I really do cite some like real kind of, I guess, icons of the left, like Leila Khaled, Huey P. Newton, Che Guevara, the most like memified figure on the left ever, maybe like the most like t-shirtified. And I guess like for me, like the example of Che Guevara was kind of interesting, because I talk about his Congo diary, and it's like even someone who is obviously like I suppose I was sort of interested in pronouncements by even figures of this kind of mythological status, who then he's kind of like, well, actually, it was really difficult, and like sometimes, you know, I made a lot of mistakes, and sometimes I got tired and needed to like. It's like, I guess I was kind of interested in not in sort of romanticizing the figure or kind of adding to this sense of the sort of mythological status, but in kind of being like, well, these are just people as well. And in the chapter on nostalgia, I set up a kind of I try to think through two different types of nostalgia, which I call moribund nostalgia. It's called nostalgia, and so one would be, you know, embalming a corpse and sort of going in and sort of venerating this dead body, and then I think about other examples that kind of cite the past in ways that actually do link in a more like vital and vibrant way to like ongoing struggles in the present. So I guess I'm kind of that those questions for me are sort of like a bit meta in some ways, because I'm like, why am I writing a book about revolutionary history? And like, do you just inevitably sort of fall into the trap of kind of, you know, citing all the same famous examples and kind of also sort of being like, oh God, if only it was like, you know, X time or whatever. And so I was trying to be a bit self-conscious about that because I think it is a danger, but I guess, you know, even Lenin was just like, you know, some guy.
Just a dude. Actually, this is making me think about, so I'm in London, and one of my favorite places in London is Highgate Cemetery, which is, of course, where Marx is buried. But my favorite thing about, like, the corner where Marx is buried is, you know, famously Claudia Jones is buried to the left of Karl Marx. But there are all of these people from all around the world just buried in that corner. And it just, like, it makes me cry every time, because I'm just like, this is like, you know, this sort of place where people, right, rather than it being like Marx's weird preserved corpse, which would be very creepy. But also like, this is actually this space where you see like literally the workers of the world uniting in death, which is, you know, sad, but also it's beautiful. And it's something different than like, we must all sort of slowly file past Lenin's tomb. And because I'm thinking about this in the context of like, right when Queen Elizabeth died, I'm like imagining that mad queue that stretched through London when the Queen died, and how like just weird and horrific that was, and like the idea of doing that for someone is very strange, you know. And it does bring me back to Joe Hill, right? Don't mourn, organize. I don't want to say don't mourn. Obviously, I wrote a whole book about grief. But there's something about like, can our mourning not be like weird reification of certain people as sort of untouchable heroes, and the rest of us as sort of, you know, always inadequate.
Which I think
go ahead.
Question of the future in a sense, because it's like a form of mourning that's also committed to something. It's not just kind of venerating and becoming fixated on a past that never changes, and that kind of, which again I think relates to your point about the kind of pleasures of doom, and that's kind of, I guess, the sort of left melancholic position in a sense, is to sort of almost like attach to, whereas like mourning and organizing, it is about trying to create a world that sort of is less harmful in a sense. So I guess it would have that sort of future oriented sort of I mean, I the point that I sort of insist on, right, the beginning of my beef with Freud was just like, grief is about the future. I didn't sort of sit around being sad about like, you know, when I was 6 and my dad brought me to, you know, go for a pony ride. I was sad because like he wasn't gonna, you know, argue with me about my book, which he would have hated. Right? Like it's like these future experiences that now I don't get to have that are the thing that like hurts. So we're getting sort of close on time. I do want to sort of blend these two questions that we got, because we've skirted around this a little bit, but I want to go straight at the annoying social media question. This question about the tribalism of contemporary politics increases our likelihood of getting burned out. Does the internet and social media make it easier or harder to process or recover from the emotional experience of defeat? And of course, I'm just thinking again about like COVID and all of us being sort of thrown into lockdown right after these big political defeats in both the US and Britain, and how just
awful that seemed to be for people's ability to like heal. But maybe there is, the internet's good too.
Yeah, I guess I wonder what I did at one point get quite obsessed with the sorts of sort of self-help kind of material that will circulate online. So I think I was thinking about the question in that way, but I guess yeah, I mean in terms of the pandemic, I think is so peculiar to me because in some ways it felt like for like about 1 millisecond it opened up these questions about reciprocity and people being reliant on one another, and actually also kind of it seems as if there was this kind of moment of like, oh, everyone's been forced to acknowledge like certain sort of kind of things that are it's kind of usually convenient to ignore about how society is organized, but that was just like so swiftly memory hold that it's kind of like it's not like anyone like absorbed the lessons of that really. It was just like, okay, well, now I mean, again, it's like the kind of back to reality in the Freudian sense.
Yeah, no, really, I'm so sort of obsessed with that, like, because it's not only that it was like memory hold, it's that it was like as if it was never there, you know, which is actually the thing that I think of as melancholic. If I think of anything as melancholic, is this like this idea that you can like wipe something out so completely that it's just like never happened. What are you talking about? Never could have done anything better. Nothing could have ever been different. It's like, no, it was. I know it was because I remember it because I was there and I wrote articles about it that I can still find, you know, like I talk to people. And that way that like just the utter sort of, you know, I spoke at the top of this night about like neoliberal denialism, but it was like, it's beyond that, right? Like we were talking before we turned this on, apologize to everyone, about Keir Starmer's purging of another faction of the left from the Labour Party, and just how like, for some of these people, just the idea that the world could be any better is the thing that they have to crush. And that just depresses the hell out of me, like on so many levels, that it's like, no, you can't have nice things is like the entire motivation of like Starmerism and Bidenism and like, you know, Macronism and any number of other countries that I could, you know, go along with here.
Yeah, people derive a surprising amount of like pleasure from that kind of completely bizarre political position, apparently.
Yeah.
Which isn't, I don't know, it doesn't even quite feel like sadism. It's like sort of more pathetic or something. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's like it's just like, oh, anyway. But I do think like the question of sort of tribalism of contemporary politics is kind of interesting, because I think it's not a word I would use. But what I would poke at is sort of the way that like, rather than like what a lot of people would think of as identity politics, rather I think there's this sort of tendency to like declare yourself something, and then like defend that identity as like, I am a socialist, I am a this, I am a that. And that's the kind of thing that like gets really, really nasty on the internet very quickly. And it is also, I don't think, a coincidence that it is a sort of politic that never admits defeat or mistakes, or, you know, that it's always just like, we were insufficiently whatever, sir, you know, and it's never insufficiently dialectical. Anyway, that like the nastiness of it is in part because like we just can't ever admit that sometimes we're wrong.
Yeah, and I wonder if I would kind of maybe, or it would be, I could more easily answer the question if instead of tribalism, it was kind of like forms of dogmatism. And I think that's saying like, a kind of inability to sort of admit sort of different sort of possibilities of like, oh, actually I messed that one up, or like, oh, actually maybe the perspective of these people from this slightly different political tradition to my own is important to kind of take on board. And Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like in the book, I tried to be, I guess, ecumenical. Like it really kind of talks about lots of different traditions, and it's sort of
Absolutely.
I was very self-consciously like trying not to be too like I'll just talk about things that I think are good or something. Like
Yeah.
I'll try and think about quite a wide range of different currents. I mean, all on the left, but still, it's like a kind of quite motley crew of different sorts of figures. And so, in some ways, I think. Like, do I think that tribalism can increases the likelihood of? I mean, I suppose that if that means like forms of kind of infighting or
Yeah.
getting so obsessed with one's own sort of like particular program that it's like not really possible to form like alliances, then like yeah, sure, I think that that can certainly like increase like the likelihood of getting burned out. For sure, yeah. I mean, because like I guess it's a form of sort of it's like your energy is going towards like people that you're ostensibly on the same side as rather than like, outwards.
Well, also, I do my best to save my hatred for the people who actually like have some power and whatever. And like, I have a deep and abiding hatred for Keir Starmer. And I try not to think that much about like people on the internet who are wrong,
Exactly. You can spend a lot of energy doing that. I mean, there's actually an example that I talk about in the book, which is this psychiatrist Robert Coles, who interviewed people who were involved in the civil rights movement, who were kind of really like, he talks about it in terms of weariness. And he kind of then talks about actually that there is the tendency to turn like against people within the movement was precisely a sort of an outcome of a kind of the problem of having engaged in something for so long and having not felt like and having got arrested like multiple times and somehow then the anger at the external society got kind of turned inwards. And he sort of identifies that as a kind of a sort of almost like a psychic coping mechanism in some ways. It's like it can happen, but yeah, I don't know, it's a kind of interesting, just it appears in some of the people that he interviewed as a real like a kind of tendency. Yeah,
Interesting. So one of the another question that we got is sort of the opposite of this, which is did either of us come across any division or practice within an organization that deals with exactly the emotional cost of politics? And I don't know that I would say exactly, but I'm thinking a lot about one particular. So I mentioned Minnesota a few times. There's a big chunk on Minneapolis and St. Paul organizing in my book. And I've written a couple of stories since for In These Times about it, because the way that the organizations there are sort of networked and supportive without requiring one another to sort of all be along the same party line. The sort of, and it's more than just like a broad church model, right? It's really built because it's been built through things like the George Floyd rebellion, the occupation of the 3rd precinct after the 5th precinct, after Jamar Clark was killed, Occupy Homes, just like decades of like really tough organizing. But in those spaces, there's a real sense that like people are whole people. It's not just like we're workers or we're this or we're that, because you have sort of tenant unions organizing alongside worker centers, organizing alongside, official trade unions. There's a, I mean, again, back to Jane, because I will never stop quoting Jane, what Jane would have called like whole worker organizing, but it's like whole person organizing. And, when your organizing includes like, do people have like a safe and dignified home? And the parks workers are on strike in Minneapolis right now. That was the sort of headline of the last piece that I wrote. And so it's thinking about like, we should have nice parks. Those should be clean. Also, the parks workers are the ones who get called in to like, remove homeless encampments, which brings us back to housing. Fights for the public schools, the question of abolishing the police or doing something other than police, or what does community safety actually look like? And when those questions are sort of already built into your organizing, I think that it makes it easier to think about the emotional costs of it. So I don't think that was exactly the answer that anybody was expecting, but yeah, that's where I'm taking my inspiration right now.
That makes a lot of sense, because it's a kind of, there's a sort of holistic, which obviously encompasses, if you're thinking about people, then that obviously includes their sort of emotional lives. I guess the example that that comes up in response to this question that I had would be, actually, like, one of the reasons that I had the idea to write the book in the first place was that I met some people that had been involved in this group in London called Red Therapy. And I was already, at the point that I encountered them, I was quite familiar with the kind of British anti-psychiatry movement, and particular understandings of sort of the social origins of mental illness and things like that. But Red Therapy were different in that they started their own therapy group in response to difficulties that they had organizing together, living communally. Basically, they started a therapy group among themselves as a way of trying to work through some of the experiences that they'd encountered as people who were kind of politically engaged, and not just in terms of sort of the organizing that they were doing, but also in terms of trying to sort of like live in alternative different ways, so like raise children collectively, etc. But then what I think was also really quite cool about a lot of those individuals is that they subsequently, so they did that practice among themselves, but then they subsequently, a lot of them like went on to do very sort of socially engaged, like a lot of them went like trained to be working in psychiatry, psychoanalysis even, but not within the sort of most kind of traditional institutions. Like they retained a sort of political outlook. So like one guy who's involved in it, this group was in the 70s, at the time that there was a kind of a version of Occupy that happened in London at St Paul's, and he was involved in that, and he started like doing free therapy sessions like at the Occupy.
Yeah,
you know, retained this kind of idea that these kinds of therapeutic practices could be embedded in political movements. And again, it was like offering therapy to people who were in those encampments and kind of, you know, so again, it was kind of, I don't know if that, it wasn't that they were particularly responding to a division, but it was definitely responding to, I guess, like, yeah, some of the strains and difficulties that they'd encountered.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's interesting you mentioned like something like Occupy, because of course one of the things that like the police, particularly in like New York City, did to try to crush Occupy was they just started releasing people from psych holds or the police, arrest, and dumping them at Occupy and trying to bring in people who had essentially more needs than the movement could handle. And so, and it was really a challenge to the sort of mutual aid ethos of the thing to say like, okay, can you handle people who are like really unwell? And of course, like the answer was kind of no. But thinking about how we build those things in from the start in this world that just makes us all sick and sad and whatever. It feels like, it is the only thing that brings me hope. We are at time. I am going to ask one more question because I can't resist. Because, so at the end of the book, you give the last words to Mike Davis, another one that we will never be able to replace. And he wrote, "Fight with hope, fight without hope, but fight absolutely." And you're also pairing that in that section with Gillian Rose's epigraph to Love's work, "Keep your mind in hell and despair not." And it makes me think of Mariam Kaba's, of course, Hope is a Discipline. So as we end here, how are you relating to the question of hope these days, Hannah?
Yeah, so I sort of end the book in with a kind of, it's a very fragmentary, inconclusive conclusion. And I think it's because I felt like, okay, I'm going to come and write the conclusion now. And I felt like I sort of almost felt like I had to write something hopeful. And it felt almost like almost like dishonest or disingenuous to write something super hopeful after I'd spent, all this time thinking about these very, very not hopeful situations. And I think, it's not that it's not hopeless, but I think I found this Mike Davis line helpful because I think maybe my understanding of fight was that, if you're without hope, then you don't fight. Basically, that being without hope is being giving up effectively, or being kind of apathetic, or being kind of so overwhelmed by the challenges that it's like impossible. And I think I found something quite sort of helpful about the idea that it's possible to fight without hope, which in itself is quite hopeful. It's paradoxically, exactly. It is quite hopeful, but I think in a sense it's like it's possible to kind of really acknowledge how utterly horrendous things are, and to not like completely give up. And I think, I don't know, for me that felt, when I read those lines, I think I found it helpful as a way of kind of not making an appeal to hope that felt sort of platitudinous, or that felt sort of unearned, or that felt kind of like, so everything's bad, but like it's gonna be great. It's like,
yep. real, but it's, yeah. Sorry. I think that's great. So yes, in the words of Comrade Davis, fight with hope, fight without hope, but keep fighting. I think that's a good place to end.